Night shifters, ever witnessed a paranormal activity? If so, what was it? I used to work at a 24 hours subway. I know, great start to a paranormal experience story, huh? Well, one day I was doing the dishes, and my coworker was cleaning the toaster oven and bread oven. Out of nowhere, around 3:30 a.m., I heard our door chime go off. Out of habit I say welcome to Subway as I turn the corner. Nobody there. Coworker gone. I thought okay, maybe he hopped the counter and went for a cigarette outside as he did from time to time. Heading back to the sink to finish the dishes, I hear the door chime again. Nobody. Checked the bathrooms. Nobody. What the hell? I ignore the dishes, and stand at the front counter, eyeing the doors. Couple minutes later, my coworker comes through the back door where we get our deliveries. Where do you go? I asked him, turning towards the back door area. To take out the trash, he replies. Door chime. He does the same thing as me, welcome to Subway, turns corner to see nobody there, but this time the door was wide open. Our doors are weighted to where they'll close on their own if you let go of them. Door stayed open for a couple minutes as we stared, then suddenly slammed. Not a windy night, and our doors wouldn't even stay open like that on the windiest of days. Have no idea what caused this, or why it happened on that particular night, but after I got a different job I was told it never happened again. Told my boss about the incident and we all looked at the cameras. Nobody could explain it. Edit, typo. I was working at a gas station at like 3 a.m. one night. A car pulled into the pump, guy got out and started pumping, and then the car and dude just vanished. I was looking right at it, and it just popped out of existence. I told my boss the next day and she turned white as a sheet. She'd seen the same thing, same exact description, same car, same pump, same guy. I worked at a movie store in college. I was closing one night and just kind of doing a final walk through. I kept hearing what sounded like movie cases shuffling. I looked around thinking maybe someone had came in last minute, although I didn't hear the bell ring for when someone enters the store. Didn't see anyone. Then I hear what sounds like a movie fall off a shelf in the kids section. I go over and there's a movie laying on the ground, and I shit you not, it was Casper. I work the front gate at a military installation. The night shift is super dull and quiet where I am at. For a while I noticed this dark green old Ford Bronco that would roll up. When I would stand out the gate shack, the car would do a 180 and leave. This happened about 2 to 3 times until I finally caught the license plate before it turned. I ran the numbers to my supervisor. He asked me if I was sure. I said I'm 100% certain. He tells me it couldn't be because the numbers led to a vehicle crash report that involved the exact same vehicle and plate number to which the driver had died, and the vehicle was totaled. That shit made me want to switch to days. I was firmly against the idea of paranormal activity prior to working in an old folks' home. You always felt watched. Always. Even when not in view of the camera. But that was the tip of the iceberg. Several times while I was working, things would fly off the walls even though it was unprovoked. I'm talking hand sanitizer containers that flew 15 feet from the wall it was on, cups that were stationary on the counter and all of a sudden flew across the room, and clipboards that just happened to all fall off the walls at once, even though they were across the room from each other. Nothing is as unsettling as Bill in 209. Bill lived in this room while he was a tenant. While someone was visiting, they stayed in room 209. The visitor came downstairs, said that Bill had come into his room, and said don't worry, it's just Bill. While he was in the shower, and then asked who Bill was. We explained that there was no one who lived or worked there named Bill. A couple days later, the same visitor was cleaning out records for the care center, where they worked. As they were doing so, they found that a resident named Bill had lived in room 209. When they told us this story, we all heard a knock on the window and turned to look at it. As we did so, clipboards and bulletin boards flew off the wall on the opposite wall. We've decided that Bill is friendly, but likes attention. He's cool. A lab building where I once worked was the site of a murder-suicide, which happened while I was there. Awful and sad. We didn't have shifts per se, but I had to work late one night autoclaving equipment for the next day's experiment. The autoclave room is right next to the lab where the event took place. I hadn't seen anyone else in the building. After I started the load, I was about to leave the room when I heard a crash outside. I immediately opened the door and saw that all the contents of a table in the hallway had been pushed to the floor. Water bottles, a packet of papers, pens, etc. Since I was right by the door at the time, I would have seen and or heard someone running away. It was against protocol to leave things in the autoclave overnight, so I had to stay an hour and a half to get them out, but nothing else happened. I left the stuff on the floor, though. Didn't want a repeat of that. Not me, but a friend used to work as a night custodian for an elementary school, which the building itself was rather old, built in the 40s maybe. He was the third shift guy, so he took over from the second shift guy at like 9 p.m. He was basically there to mop the floors and make sure no one broke in. If he got all of his stuff done, he was pretty much free to do whatever he wanted. Often after he finished doing his work, he'd go hang out in an office because there was a small TV to watch. He said things started off innocently enough. Lights turning on in classrooms where he knew they had been off previously, cabinets and doors opening and closing on their own. He didn't pay much attention to it at first. He was sort of on the fence as to where he believed in paranormal activities, so he just shrugged it off as coincidences. At first, he would go and check the noises out. Sometimes he'd creep around and try to catch someone in the act, in case there was a way in that he didn't know about. After a month or so, he gave up looking and just learned to ignore it. He'd ask his boss about it and just get blown off. Over the coming months, things progressively got worse. Doors no longer closed on their own. They slammed shut. He heard noises like children playing, sometimes screaming. He'd find trash cans turned upside down. He'd have things thrown at him, but he would be clearly alone with nowhere for someone to hide and throw things at him. He'd contemplated quitting, but he was making good money for being nearly fresh out of high school and he needed the money for family stuff, so he stuck with it. He'd come in, rush through his duties for the night as quickly as he could and then go and sit in the office where he'd turn the TV to where he could sit facing the door, and that's where he'd sit until the morning crew came in at 6 a.m. He didn't want to admit that he was scared shitless of being in that school by himself at night, so he tried to tough it out and made a lot of excuses to try and explain what was going on. The last straw for him was the night he was sitting in the office watching TV and felt someone grab the chair from behind and flip him over backward. There was clearly no one in the room and no way for anyone to get into the room without him seeing them. He picked up the office phone and called his boss at home in the middle of the night, said he quit and he'd come back in the morning to turn his keys in. He was definitely a believer in the paranormal after that experience. He said that it wasn't until years later that he found out from someone who'd researched the history of the school before it was torn down that there used to be a pool inside the school. A number of kids had drowned in over the early years of the school until the administration decided to finally expand the building, so they filled the pool in with concrete and expand over top of it. I worked in a mine in northern Ontario. There was a death on the 4,200 level a couple years previous to the incident. It was a normal day underground like any other. We were rehabbing old working that had collapsed. 4,200 level was big, the drifts were 6 times 6 feet, but go on for kilometers in every direction. It was about midnight when we saw the mine rescue team with security rushing down the drift. Naturally, we dropped what we were doing and followed to see if we could help. We arrived to a guy who was as pale as a ghost. He didn't look hurt, but he was shaking uncontrollably. Mine rescue approached him and he wouldn't have it. He would scream, and not just any scream. It was terrifying hearing the screams, like a person so consumed with fear, it had a tone to it that you wouldn't imagine could come from a person. Eventually he just stopped screaming and just sat there, awake but non-responsive. By now it was 3:30 a.m. and our shift was over. We couldn't leave him down there. We managed to get him on a stretcher that we could carry out. On our way out he kept saying the devil is on 42. Over and over again. About 2 years later, another incident report was read to us, the exact same thing, exactly the same spot, but a different person. I don't believe they saw the devil, but it is always in the back of my mind when I'm on 42. Used to work at IHOP. A cook before my time got shot and died during robbery. I would always hear someone in the kitchen, such as the spatulas clanking, but nobody would be in the kitchen. Once I saw a black figure in the back, figured it was the cook. When I went outside to the front of the restaurant, the cook was sitting outside smoking. There was no current orders either. Other co-workers experienced some stories. One of them said she felt pushed, but I can't speak on what I didn't see. I don't have a story, but here is the one my wife likes to tell. She is a nurse and for a couple of years she was working night shift in the palliative care unit, which is the comfort care / end of life unit. Patients in that unit are expected to die, or to be sent home or to a care home to die. Anyways, those rooms also had a radio, and according to her it happened a few times that a radio suddenly turned on, and within an hour or so a patient would pass on. One rather busy night, the radio turned on and my wife went into the room, stared into the darkness and said, "Cut that out. I don't have time for this shit." And the radio suddenly snapped off. No patient died during the rest of her shift, but one passed away shortly after she clocked out. Not a night shiftier, but my dad kind of was. He was also against the idea of paranormal activity, but now agrees that sometimes there are things that cannot be explained. He was a college student working towards his doctorate in dentistry. However, due to school being expensive as hell, he had to live in a rundown apartment in the bad side of Philly. As a result, he would occasionally wake up at night since he had to scare off several attempted home invaders. Therefore he was a light sleeper, and any kind of noise would instantly wake him up and make him do rounds around the apartment to make sure there were no intruders. After the second or third break-in, the gangs learned to stay away from the apartment due to his reputation of becoming Rambo to fight them off. He and his roommate had an old, really freaking old, fridge that had a light that did not work and came with the purchase. This is important to the story. The apartment building was also built in the 1960s but had been converted to a sort of loft house with only one apartment room available for rent. Roommate and him split it into 2 living quarters, with a tiny kitchen, bathroom, a basement, and a bare front door with broken glass. The kitchen was directly next to the bedroom and the walls were paper thin. One night, he heard someone moving around in the kitchen. Of course, he snatched up his hunting knife and investigated. The fridge door was open, and the light was on. An old woman wrapped in a shawl was bent over examining the contents. My dad yelled, "Hey!" She turned, and snap. The light went off. She vanished. And the door of the fridge suddenly slammed shut. To this day he has no clue who she was or what she was. I don't inherently believe in ghosts, but if I had a paranormal story it will be this one. I work in one of the major ERs in my city as HCA. One of my many tasks is post-mortem care on patients who die in our care. One night at around 02:00 I was called to the room of an older patient who was palliative, had passed and the family had finished their goodbyes. So I went in to start providing care. This usually means removing any tubes, wires, and monitors from the patient, giving them a bed bath, removing any valuables from the body to give to the family, putting them in a gown and shroud. I like to talk to my patients even if they have passed, as it puts me at ease, and shows respect to them. I explain my actions and talk them through what I'm doing, because even though they have passed they are still my patient. While I was proceeding with the bed bath of the patient, out of nowhere I felt like I was being watched, and then I felt a hand on my shoulder and a man's voice tell me thank you. The hand remained for a moment while I stood there frozen, then all the feelings stopped and the room felt empty. There were no other nurses or staff in the area at the time, just me. I like to believe that the patient I was providing care for was thankful for my explanations and me continuing to talk to them through their care. I've been in law enforcement for several years now. I serve a small, rural town. During the summer of 2015, I had one of my most unsettling experiences. That evening my partner and I were called to investigate a potential trespasser on some residential property out in the sticks. A young girl, about 15 or 16 years old, had called 911 and reported that a person wearing a clown costume was loitering around her backyard. I'll refer to her as Sarah. She was extremely frightened when we arrived. Her mother had to work late that night, so Sarah was home alone. She explained that a tall person in a clown costume had repeatedly emerged from the woods in her backyard. She first saw him when she went to let her dog out. He was peering at her from behind a tree, beckoning her to come over. I could hear him laughing, she said. She ran inside with her pet, locked the door, and immediately called 911. She watched from a window as the clown reappeared several times from the woods, exhibiting erratic behavior. Sarah described the clown's appearance as really scary, not at all like the silly, colorful characters typically seen. He had a quintessential red nose, but wore a dark-colored jumpsuit. She thought his face was painted white with dark shapes around his eyes. No hair or head accessories, according to her. After investigating inside the home, we checked the perimeter of the house. My partner stayed behind to monitor the doors while I approached the tree line. No sooner than I shined my flashlight into the woods that I heard the sounds of snapping tree limbs, as if someone was walking through the forest about 20 yards away. I called out, announcing myself as a police officer. No response, no more sounds. Not sure who or what, if anything, we were dealing with, Bill and I did not venture into the woods. It was the middle of the night with limited visibility. I focused my attention on investigating the property for anything suspicious while Bill patrolled around the house. Nothing of interest was found. Over the next couple of months, our department received several more calls about clown sightings. Not only did these sightings occur within a 5-mile radius of each other, but all of them were reported by young people. This being a small, rural town, we initially thought this was all some kind of prank/hoax orchestrated by a bunch of bored kids. These kids, however, seemed genuinely frightened upon investigation and their descriptions were consistent. We really didn't know what to think. No one or nothing was ever found in these cases, with the exception of one. Around sunset one evening, we received a phone call from an elderly woman I'll call Helen. She was a sweet lady who played the organ at a church in town. Although she was devoutly religious, like the kind of person who'd quote scripture in the middle of a conversation, she meant well. Anyways, Helen called and said that her grandson, whom she was raising, saw a clown in their yard. She was concerned and wanted the police to investigate. Her grandson was only 5 and getting details out of him proved difficult. In a rather matter-of-fact kind of way, Helen said, "Officer, those clowns are devil worshippers. I know it because right after my grandson saw that clown, my mother's nutcracker, that one right there on top of the fireplace, fell and broke. I've been praying hard ever since. Sure enough, her nutcracker was broken into 2 pieces. I did an internal eye roll and redirected the conversation. Let me walk outside and check things out, I said. Helen followed behind me as we walked out the back door. Everything was still and quiet. I asked if there were any places on the property where someone could hide. She said there was an old, overgrown shed about 1/4 mile behind her house. I radioed in for support, and an officer named Pete arrived soon after. Thankfully it was a lightly wooded area so the shed was easy enough to find. It was quite dilapidated and half falling down. The door was slightly ajar. We called out but there wasn't a response. We had flashlights in our left hands and our right hands on our weapons. The door creaked open and slowly we walked in. There was no one inside. Besides old, rusty farm equipment, we noticed a couple of strange items scattered around the floor. The first thing we noticed was a brass cow figurine. It had what looked to be 3 initials etched on it, but they were hard to make out. One was possibly an M and Pete thought he saw a K. Second, we found a Bible with burn marks all over it. We later learned the entire book of Leviticus had been torn out. Helen adamantly swore she had no idea who the items belonged to or why they were in that shed. The whole thing was very overwhelming for her. We brought the items to the station but nothing ever surfaced. That was the last clown sighting. Maybe it was a series of pranks, an odd fad that came and went. Whatever the case, it all sticks out to me as something incredibly strange. I always feel uneasy whenever I think about those events. Worked at a movie theater running the booths upstairs. The projectors are upstairs, obviously, in a long corridor. At night, after the last showing in each theater, you shut off the lights to that theater and the small one over the projector itself. Then you cover the platters to protect from dust. It's not so bad the first few, because at least the lights of nearby projectors are still on for the theaters that are still running. But, as you shut each one off one by one, the corridor gets darker and darker and that little viewing window into each individual theater is pitch black. That dull, steady whirring noise you've toned out all night is gone and is now replaced by absolute silence, and there's hardly any light left anymore. Just the lights at the end of each corridor where you sit in between each start time. It's spooky enough is what I'm saying. But one particular night, I'm throwing the covers over one of the platters and I casually glance up into the viewing theater window across the way. And there's a face. It's a little boy's face and it's sheet white. I know what I saw. I'm sure there's an explanation for it and there's nothing supernatural about it, but there was a face there and it scared the absolute shit out of me. It made an already unsettling environment that much more terrifying the rest of the time I worked there. Also, for the record, inside the actual theater, these windows are a solid 8 to 10 feet above the seat backs in the highest row. So, if someone was playing a prank, they'd need a ladder and even then they'd have nowhere to set it. I worked night shift at a hotel. I also had a day job and the manager was cool and said I could sleep as long as I woke up if someone needed something. One night, I woke up and saw a guy. Well, more of a silhouette of a guy. Staring at me through the windows of the Dutch door to the courtyard. He was really tall, 6.5 feet, and had a black duster/trench coat and hat. I jumped up from the couch, put down the remote I had fallen asleep with in my hand and rushed to the door to see what he needed. He was gone. And no sign of him anywhere in the courtyard, and there were only 2 long, straight paths. He couldn't even have ran that fast. I forget about it and continue my night. Fast forward about 3 weeks and my co-worker is telling me about an evil spirit that lives in one of the rooms. All the employees knew there were at least 4 haunted rooms there, as well as the elevator. No, seriously. He started describing a tall shadowy guy. I cut him off and say like 6 or 7 feet? Black coat and hat? He turns white and stares at me. You've seen it too? I tell him what happened. And that innocent incident that night all of a sudden got super creepy. Another time, at another job. I was getting ready to do security rounds. Roughly around 3:15 a.m. I am whistling the Arthur movie theme song. It had just played on the radio. It was dead quiet except just crickets. As I open the door to the patrol car, still whistling, I hear a whistle off in the bushes on a 60-feet cliff. It's the same tune. In the same type of whistle I don't whistle normal. It's like a windier, not sharp kind of whistle, and much quieter. Same exact song. Same exact type of whistle. I immediately stop. The whistling keeps going. I get into the car and book it. Take about 20 minutes longer than I normally do to get back, and am super careful/nervous/paranoid when I get back. Never saw anyone or anything. Never heard it again. But on that note, sometimes if I fell asleep at that job, I'd wake up to the sound of my old boss shouting my name. He used to come in about the same time that I would hear the sound and wake up. That happened pretty regularly. The weird thing is that he had been dead for 3 years when it started. Night watch in the barracks at Fort Gordon. That's a night shift, right? Anyway, so many things happened in 3 different rooms that I could write a book. It completely changed my belief in paranormal activity. This one took place in the middle of the night, so this is the one I'll tell. I'm sitting by the stairwell on the 2nd floor and hear someone shouting in a room down a hallway. I'm on duty, so I run to the room and swing open the door expecting to see some fighting. There are several people in this room pointing up to the ceiling next to a wall and telling me they're doing it again. I ask them to explain and they tell me that ever since they moved into that room someone lifts up the ceiling tiles and makes funny faces at them at night. The latrine is on the other side of the wall, so I go over to see if anyone is there and there isn't. So I climb onto a desk in the room to lift up the ceiling tiles to see if they're still up there. When I lift up the ceiling tiles, all I see is a cinder block wall that goes all the way to the floor above. There's only about an inch between the back of the ceiling tile and the wall. No way a face was there. 2 of the soldiers freaked out and ran out of the room and slept in the hallway. This was only the first of many incidents. I'm a dedicated night shift nurse. Several years ago the unit that I worked on was kinda off on its own, the oldest part of a 100-plus-year-old hospital. During some basic repairs they found some mold, and according to rumors, asbestos, in the walls. So my unit got shut down for a couple months for repairs. They kept the nurses on wherever they could, with the result that we were occasionally really bored thanks to acting as clerks or doing random odd jobs. A co-worker/friend at the time was really into ghost hunting, to the point of buying a decent quality ghost hunting kit. Thanks to not exactly being needed, we had ample time to wander the spookier corners of the hospital overnight. We didn't find a whole lot, just the occasionally EMF spike or whatever that could be easily explained. After a couple of weeks, they took down the strict construction isolation stuff for our unit and we decided to check out some of our supposedly haunted rooms. The place was eerie AF. They had all the utilities shut off, remember, it was separate from the rest of the hospital, and it was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. We went into one of the rooms where a lot of deaths had occurred, thanks to being close to the nurses' station where we could put more critical patients. We set up a voice recorder, thermometer, and an EMF detector. Then we started to ask any present spirits questions. Standard stuff like if they had died in the room, etc. Within a few minutes of us asking random questions, the temperature dropped a couple of degrees. Then, the EMF monitor started going off in short little bursts. Right as I asked the question, "Are you angry you died here?" the EMF squealed like a stuck pig and we decided to get the hell out of there. The next morning, we went to my place to play the audio recording through my computer. Everything was on it, our questions and the EMF noises. Right as I asked my last question of the night, there was this sound that coincided with the EMF burst we heard in the room. It was this low, drawn-out moaning sound that sounded like an enhanced version of a death moan/rattle. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, along with the worst case of goosebump ever. I've seen a lot of weird shit in my time as a nurse. I'm also a firm skeptic and love my peer-reviewed evidence. But I can't quite believe that recording noise/temperature drop EMF readings was something normal that happened in an isolated unit of the hospital with all the utilities shut off. Edit, like many other paranormal events, I can't provide proof. The recording was lost in 2014 when my laptop was stolen. I work on a boys' unit at a mental hospital. Recently my patients have been complaining about seeing ghosts in their rooms at night, claiming they've seen things, coloring pages and art they've taped up, fly off the walls, doors open and close by themselves, and a few patients have claimed to see full-body apparitions. Given their age and psych status, I'd usually take their stories with a grain of salt, but actually I sort of believe them. The hospital opened as an asylum in the mid-1800s, and patients have definitely died there. Much of the original building is still used, including my unit, and honestly, when I walk around the halls at night, hours after the patients have fallen asleep, it legitimately does feel like someone is always watching me. I think it's just a matter of time until I have my own ghostly encounter.